The NATO alliance is staging a nuclear exercise in the skies over Western Europe. The training exercise, called Steadfast Noon, comes as tensions between the West and Russia continue to escalate following Moscow's nuclear threats in Ukraine. SABC News Correspondent Cadier joins us from NATO's headquarters in Brussels. Thank you so much for your time. NATO saying this exercise is not linked to world events and had long been scheduled, but some have seen it as quite a significant show of force given the situation in Ukraine. Does everybody, including Moscow, believe that this is part of the routine?
Well, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg last week was pressed on this very point, asked whether or not the NATO alliance should cancel this exercise. He said it would send the absolute wrong signal and reiterated the fact that this has been scheduled since before the start of the invasion and the fact that this is an annual drill with NATO allies. The other additional piece of information that was in the release by NATO about this drill is that no live ammunition will be used. Now, it's 60 aircraft from 40 countries. That's a mixture of fighter jets and reconnaissance aircraft and tankers, but also B-52 long-range bombers flying over from North Dakota in the United States to take part in these drills. They're hosted here in Belgium by the Belgian Defense Ministry and will fly over the United Kingdom, Belgium and the North Sea. But to that point of whether or not this is business as usual, there's certainly some eyebrows raised about whether or not this is the right time. As I said, NATO making it very clear they don't want to change their schedule. Ultimately, NATO's point on this is as long as there are nuclear weapons and as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. It's very much a deterrent. It's very much a scheduled routine training exercise between NATO members. So that's 14 NATO countries. Now, you would imagine, and you'd probably be not surprised to hear, that officials in that building behind me, NATO headquarters, are quite tight-lipped about the details of this operation. Fighter jets from the United Kingdom we know are involved, but for example the Canadians over in North America are not involved. Very hard to get much more detail on that, but we know that it's bombers, fighter jets, some of the most advanced last generation, fifth generation fighter jets from the NATO allies flying over the skies of Belgium, but certainly being described by NATO as a routine operation and not an escalation of violence or a show of force.
And given the fact that, we're seeing reports of drone bombings in Kiev, and NATO has reiterated its support for Ukraine before, could we see an even more pledge of support? What else could we hear them say in this regard?
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems for NATO and for any of the European or Western nations that are trying to support Ukraine in its fight against the invasion by Russia, is how do you adapt to the changing threats? We were here just last week at the NATO defense ministers meeting, and that week and those meetings were all about Russian missiles. How do we help the Ukrainians fight back against Russian missile strikes? We saw those Russian missile strikes targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Well, this week, it's now about drone strikes, as we've seen this morning. Now, luckily, NATO has slightly preempted this threat. They are sending hundreds of anti-drone jammers, which make certain drones unable to operate in Ukrainian airspace, so jamming the radio signals and jamming any of the radar signals that these drones operate with. So that's one of the things they're doing. They're also going to be sending air defense systems. So the Germans have pledged 4, the United States sending 2, Spain also sending a few, as well as France committing air defenses. The UK, meanwhile, sending AMRAAM missiles, which can be fired from American systems, again, to fight against these Russian missile strikes. But it's very much all about drones right now, but also looking forward to the winter. The Canadians, for example, pledging to send 500,000 winter jackets, specialist winter jackets. Obviously, the Canadians very adept at fighting in extremely cold weather, and so they're sending that kind of equipment, non-lethal equipment, to support Ukraine ahead of what will be a very difficult winter, to be sure. So all sorts of different reactions. NATO certainly monitoring the situation in Ukraine very closely.
And it does look like a very fast developing story if you look at the recent days. Thank you so much, Alex, for your time there and that update. That's our correspondent, Cadier, coming to us live from NATO's headquarters in Brussels.